Hi, everyone. My name is Eliot Olson. I am the Trans, Intersex, and Non-Binary Program Officer at New Haven Pride Center. My pronouns are he, him. And thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge the land on which we are hosting this event. The New Haven Pride Center was founded and operates on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Pagusset, Niantic, and Quinnipiac peoples. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the native peoples whose lands you occupy, the history of the place you were in, and if you are willing to go the extra mile, you can go to Native Lands at native-land.ca and learn more. Welcome to the New Haven Pride Center's continuing programming during Trans Week of Awareness. For all of those tuning in, thank you so much. For all of those in the future who will see this later, same thing. Trans Week of Awareness, we're bringing you events, we're bringing you art exhibits, panels, socials, so much more. This week is going to culminate on November 20th, which is Trans Day of Remembrance, where we will be holding a vigil on the New Haven Green at 3 p.m., remembering those lost to hate and violence during the last year in the trans community. If you are able, if you are willing, please show up and be there. We will be holding space for each other, and we will be honoring those in our community that didn't make it through the year with the rest of us. So today's panel, however, is on a little bit of a different note. Today, we will be talking with some amazing panelists surrounding the history of medicalization and the pathologization of trans community members. We're going to be talking about gender-affirming care, ways trans people have been misunderstood in the medical field, which has a long history, and the hurdles, most importantly, that trans people face in accessing care today. Questions like, do you have to be diagnosed to medically transition, right? How has the approach to providing gender-affirming care changed over the years? What is WPATH? What is informed consent? Why is it so hard to get insurance to cover necessary care? What are your options for going on hormone therapy, HRT, and other services? This is what we're going to be talking about today. So without further ado, let's dive into the conversation. So I'm super excited to introduce our panelists. First off, we have Kirill Staklo, who is joining us. Hello.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Kirill is a trans and intersex rights, Rome liberation, anti-war, and anti-racism activist based in New Haven, Connecticut. He does crisis and suicidology and peer support at Peer Pride, and a trans and BIPOC-led equity consulting and peer support organization. You're a long-term volunteer with the New Haven Pride Center and the Answer Coalition as well, doing organizing around the city. And you're also a board member of Life in My Days, another mutual aid and peer support nonprofit. I know you regularly speak and present on intersex and trans issues for legislators and educators, healthcare providers, all of that good stuff, right? So I'm really excited to have you as part of this conversation so we can talk about, we have the grassroots organizing side of things about how we as community members can kind of enact change, but then we also have dealing with these very large infrastructures that have their own bureaucratic way of changing.
Thank you. Really
Of course.
excited to be here.
Next, Layne. I'm gonna mess up your name again, Layne. The last name, Gianakos.
It's close enough.
No, I'm so sorry.
That's fine.
Gianakos.
Gianakos.
I only make it worse the more I talk.
It's not intuitive. Yeah.
So, Layne, I know you have a super long career in public health, working at APNH, working at Anchor Health. You've worked with providing services for people living with HIV and also preventative measures as well. At Anchor Health, you created a comprehensive and extremely unique case management program specifically for the LGBTQ plus community that is still being used. And now you're doing inclusion trainings, equity, diversity, and other services for healthcare organizations. Again, I'm so happy to have you in the conversation.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Last but absolutely not least, Jillian Celentano.
Hi, so great to be here. Thank you.
Hi, absolutely. I'm so happy you can make it. Just speaking a couple words about you so the rest of our audience knows. Jillian is a trans woman who began her transition in 2015, recently received bachelor's degree in psychology at Albertus Magnus, and you're now pursuing your master's, correct?
Correct.
In social work.
Graduate in May. Sorry.
Yeah. No. You're an author, you're an advocate for the trans community, you do mentoring for trans youth, you've organized support groups for kids and young adults. I know you're currently involved in 2 trans studies at Yale, and you also interned at the Yale Gender program as well. And I would be very remiss not to mention your book, Transitioning Later in Life, A Personal Guide. Yep. Check it out. It's on Amazon. So yes, thank you so much for joining in the conversation. And let's dive in if everybody is ready. So, right, I talked a little bit at the beginning of the event about why we were here, basically. And we're talking about WPATH and the history, and maybe a little bit about Harry Benjamin, the standards of care beforehand, and how we transferred to WPATH, and some things that aren't really good. So maybe let's just start with a really basic thing for people who are just tuning in and wanting to learn more. Can we maybe give a brief description of what WPATH standards of care is? Not necessarily how it came about, but a brief overview, just so we get that out of the way for everyone.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about the WPATH standards of care. So first and foremost, it's an acronym. WPATH stands for the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And currently it's used as sort of the standards of care when you're looking at providing medicine to transgender individuals. And it's an evolution from, Eliot mentioned some earlier standards that were used. The predecessor was the Harry Benjamin standards of care. And today, I think we're here to talk a little bit about what the WPATH standards are, but how we think that it can evolve beyond that.
I have my own thing I would add to that, but I don't want to cut off anyone else. Does anybody have kind of an additional comment to Layne's very, very good SparkNote version?
I think that's pretty good, pretty dead on. What Layne said, definitely.
Yeah, I think we'll get into more of what that looks like in terms of contrasting WPATH SOC with informed consent later in the conversation. But yeah, I think Layne summarized it perfectly.
You know, the one thing I think that I just want to add is with WPATH from when it started till now, I always wondered, is there a list of people on the board or the decision makers who set these standards of care? How many on there are trans, non-binary versus cis? That's what I want to know, because that's where I have a problem with it sometimes.
Absolutely. I actually think that's a great lead in to kind of the next the next question that I was going to go to. You know, the standards used before WPATH, Layne and I both mentioned it, the Harry Benjamin system, was really bad. In that, you know, it wasn't accepted that you could be gay and trans, for instance. That was just not medically possible. And, you know, it really perpetuated some harmful stereotypes and myths about trans people, and how trans people should be acting. So I'm kind of wondering, how do you think some of those myths and stereotypes transferred over into the current WPATH system? And I should note, we are on, I think, the 6th revision of WPATH, or the 7th. So it has been continually updated, but only so much. And Jillian, like you said, right, who's in control of these changes? Are these actual trans community members, or is this a bunch of cisgendered people? Almost, I don't want to be super mean here, but guessing at what would be the best course of action. Yeah, I kind of leave it open to the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just quickly say that, you know, I mean, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of good with it. You know, I don't want to bash it, but, you know, again, as long as they're open to continue to evolve and allow more trans, non-binary people on the board, which I think they're starting to do, because I've seen some applications, which is really good. But you're right, like they're basing stuff they're reading on, you know, books, they're on peer review articles, and but do they really know, you know, what it's like to go into a bathroom or be misgendered? They can read about it, and so that's where, when they write their standards of care, I think some of it's on, but some of it is just a little bit maybe too mechanical.
And piggybacking off of that and it being mechanical, I think that it ignores a lot of the lived reality of being a trans person. It's a lot of guessing what we need to do in order to be ascertaining our own gender and asserting our gender to other people, but there's not a lot of forethought into what would that look like. So when we're talking about the evolution of something like the Harry Benjamin standards, for example, the reason why it wasn't medically possible for you to be gay and transgender was because there was a very rigid idea of what it would be to be a man or a woman, and trans people were unfairly forced to full-heartedly embrace those very stereotypical ideas of what it is to be a man or a woman. So a transgender woman who was interested in women would not be able or allowed to transition under the Harry Benjamin standards of care. And those myths aren't just perpetuated in the general public now, but still in the standards of care. For example, one of the things that they really encourage is for people to live in their affirmed gender for a period of time before they're allowed to initiate hormone therapy. And Jillian, what you were saying, that they're not necessarily thinking about the danger of walking into a bathroom presenting as your affirmed gender when maybe you haven't been able to have medical interventions. It's not really rooted in the reality of what it is to be living as a trans person.
Yeah, Layne basically said a lot of what I was going to say, specifically regarding like when cis people get to decide, right? Like whether or not we are willing to suffer enough and subject ourselves to enough humiliation and danger in order to pursue medical transition. I think that a lot of that power that's held in a system like that is where a lot of violence results for trans people. And I think speaking specifically from a mental health standpoint and like, you know, trying to either mitigate or prevent crisis for our community, it's very interesting to see how mental health providers specifically are trained on different iterations of WPATH to assess trans people for how much are you willing to suffer and how much effort are you putting in to, you know, put yourself in danger. And not considering the mental health impacts of forcing a person to do that you are then going to have to resolve with your client to a further degree because your client has experienced violence, harassment, you know, extreme dysphoria. So yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up, Layne, because I think that that's one of the very dangerous parts that still remains in the WPATH, especially in the different ways that it's applied in different states in the United States, where you'll have a much more strict implementations of it, where you have to prove things for longer, try harder, and endanger yourself more. Yeah.
I kind of want to go off of, you know, what all of you were talking about before, but specifically, Layne, right? These rigid standards that were used in Harry Benjamin and are still, you know, understood today in society as, you know, man and woman. And I think one of the ways that we can see even the current standards of care failing us is in the treatment of non-binary trans folks. You know, I have heard so many stories from community members, and I hate to repeat myself, but you know, I brought this up in yesterday's panel, I believe too, but I will say it again so more and more people know. You know, if you want to go on hormones and you're non-binary and say you aren't espousing, right, well, I was assigned female at birth, but I've been playing with trucks since I was a toddler, right? Some like kind of really base affirming kind of things to a medical provider will be like, well, obviously your gender is not what was assigned. I think specifically with non-binary community members, the WPATH system really fails them because it has carried over, not in full force, but in some ways, those rigid standards of what is masculinity, what is femininity, and what is allowed for each category of person. So kind of going off of that a little bit, I was wondering, you know, can we maybe talk about some double standards about medical transition as compared to other types of medical care? Because I can, you know, I can think about and think of a lot of instances where if I wanted to do something as a cis man, it wouldn't be questioned in any way. However, say I am a younger trans guy, I'm you know, under 20. But I've transitioned really early in life, and now I'm looking to do certain medical procedures. You know, does my age affect this? Even though at the same time, you know, I didn't even transition. I went on puberty blockers before anything happened physiologically. So yeah, kind of double standards and where we can compare other medical procedures done outside of the trans context to within, and how that maybe sheds light on some of the biases and myths that are at the foundation of the system.
Sure. I can say a few things. I think probably my co-panelists are going to know more about this than me. But something that's really interesting to see is like you mentioned being like a minor, for example, right? I think something that's a very clear example of a double standard, and this is something that I've talked to like reproductive justice people about a lot, is we have this fantastic provision for minors to be able to access hormonal birth control, by their like of their own volition, with their own informed consent, without participation from a family member or, having to prove anything to a therapist or anything like that. The same hormones that are used in hormonal birth control are also often used for, HRT for trans feminine people. You can't electively go on HRT or puberty blockers as a trans feminine person, or go on T or puberty blockers as a trans masculine person at the same age, interstate, with the same types of risks associated with HRT, right, and puberty blockers, as that are very similar and comparable to birth control related risks. And there's a very clear double standard there, where people will say, oh, we don't know what could happen to trans youth if we allow them to get medically necessary care, like gender affirming HRT, but we're totally cool with cisgender people accessing birth control at a young age, which they should. But the double standard there is very clear, because even the drug is the same. A lot of the time, even the dose is similar, depending on like what what you need. So there's that. Yeah, something else that comes up is like just the ease with which cis people can access surgeries that trans people have to fight for, such as things like breast augmentation, right? Breast reduction versus like mastectomy. There's some other things like, going back to like hormones, cis people can access, testosterone treatment easily, depending on what's going on for them. I've heard of that happening. So there's a lot of ease and a lot of facilitation of cis people accessing the exact same thing that trans people need, much more urgently a lot of the time. And there's so many barriers put in place for us that there's literally no medical explanation for it. It's just systemic transphobia. Yeah, so I don't know. Probably Layne and Jillian have more to contribute on that, but that's something I definitely hear from a lot in peer support.
I see a comment coming in of somebody saying they needed a clinical letter to get breast implants, for example. Cisgender women don't have to do that. There's a lot of later in life hormone treatments that are becoming more popular now. Specifically, I hear a lot about low T, and cisgender men over a certain age. It's actually easier for them to access testosterone than it is for a trans person if we're using the standards of care as they're outlined in WPATH. So that double standard, thank you for bringing that up.
And it's always, and there could be words used like mutilation, or doing these things to our body. But like, for instance, puberty blockers, they've been around a long time, and they're used for all kinds of medical reasons. For, when cis females say they have their period too early in life, they put them on blockers. That's okay. That's okay. All of a sudden, blockers aren't dangerous and they have no side effects. But when you're trans, well, this is, this and that. So another huge, I've seen that a lot at the gender clinic, is, stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Are there you mentioned myths too, right? Like, in addition to double standard, I think there's so much linked with that, right? Especially around gender affirming care for youth. You see so many cis people, saying things like, I'm not putting my 5-year-old on hormones or under a surgeon's knife or whatever. Like, they hear this absurd stuff. There's a lot of misinformation about how blockers work, which I think Layne can probably speak to a lot better than me, having probably talked to people about this more than I have. But there's so much fear mongering about things that are very, very safe comparatively to a lot of other treatments that are normalized in medicine. And yeah, I think the other thing that I would touch on when it comes to like double standards is when it comes to youth autonomy in terms of accessing medical care, the hypocrisy that exists between the same people advocating against trans youth accessing gender affirming treatment and advocating for intersex youth having non-consensual hormonal treatment or surgical interventions at a young age or at birth. It's the same logic that stems from, I don't want people who deviate from an endosex or a cisgender norm to have bodily autonomy. Because we don't want to normalize the fact that people and bodies exist on a spectrum and people can determine what they need themselves, and medicine can support them in that. So that was the only other thing I would add.
Well, and what we've all been talking about is this proposed danger that for some reason hormones are more dangerous when it's a trans person using it. I can think back to a client that I had who presented to the emergency room for GI distress. So, nausea, diarrhea, pretty straightforward. The attending physician took her off all of her hormones and she became suicidal within a matter of days. When our office found out, she had already been off the hormones, but our doctor had a very long conversation with the physician and said, why would you take somebody off of the hormones? There's absolutely no link between what she's experiencing and her hormones. And this doctor did not understand that. This doctor just saw a trans person on hormones, saw them presenting with some type of medical distress, and thought to themselves, okay, well, let's eliminate the hormones because I think that could be part of the problem here. For some reason, hormones just are more dangerous to the medical community when they're being used for a trans person's transition.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead, please.
I know, I was going to say, yes, I've seen that many times when I was at the clinic, when one of the youth needed a surgery for something totally, different. And the first question is, well, I think we may have to stop the hormones. And the doctor's there like, well, wait a minute, the endocrinologist, like, well, they're going to produce hormones. It has one, nothing has to do with the other. So the endos there have to end up explaining to the surgeons, and it's a big conversation and it's ridiculous. And I understand we're looking out for the safety, but you're right. One wasn't related to the other. So I did see that a lot as well.
And when we look at something like suicide risk versus any risks that there are with hormone therapy, I mean, especially let's talk about youth, transmasculine adolescents, more than 50% of them attempt suicide. So more than half of them are attempting suicide. The danger of that versus the danger of something like a blood clot happening with hormone therapy are so far from each other. And it becomes, what's actually the most ethical and effective way of treating this individual.
I love the comment that just scrolled across from Carly, a little tongue-in-cheek, and just saying, got your cerebral cortex ripped out. Oh, no big deal. It was just your hormones. I mean, it's very, it's catty in the best way, but we're talking about a real level of gatekeeping, exactly, right? And I think this really nicely leads into kind of the next tier of the conversation that I was hoping to get to, or more to explore, is right, you have a problem, it's your hormones. Oh, you want a surgery that everyone else can get usually? Well, we're going to need 5 different letters, and maybe just for good measure, you should have it notarized too. I'm being a little sarcastic here, obviously, but the double standard is clear, right? And the misinformation is clear. So how do we as trans people, as allies of trans people, as the queer community in large, right, protecting each other, combat the pathologization of trans people in general? Because it comes back to something we started talking about at the very beginning of this conversation, when we're talking about WPATH standards. We have, maybe not a lot of trans people writing these texts. And therefore, we have an understanding of medical need and a complete lack of understanding for lived reality. And so, you know, thinking about everything we've touched on, and I think Carly has also commented, because we aren't seen as real, it's ridiculous. There is a lot of truth in that. You know, trans people are becoming more and more accepted. We're on TV shows, we're in movies. I will always mention Laverne Cox on the cover of Times. At the same time, though, is this representation really showing evolution of knowledge, and maybe more to the point, an actual acceptance of a trans person as a person, and not somebody that needs to be medicalized down into some very neat diagnosis. That was a little rambly. I will say I have some strong opinions about this, so please, any of that touched on anything you were already thinking, feel free to go for it.
Well, what's interesting is that, you know, we've come so far and yet we haven't made that much progress when it comes to the standards of care for treating trans people. It sort of started with the Harry Benjamin standards, and this we're talking 1950s, right? Like this is the very beginnings of trans medicine. So we had the Harry Benjamin standards. Then the standards after that are commonly referred to as the gatekeeping standards. And that is what I experienced when I initiated hormones 11 years ago. And this is where they had very ridiculous and specific things, like you needed to attend a birthday party as your affirmed gender. You needed to have life events, something like a graduation or some type of ceremony. You needed to attend them as your affirmed gender in order to even be evaluated for potential hormone therapy. It wasn't a guarantee. And after that, we have the WPATH standards, and we're on the 7th edition now, but really that's how far we've gone, right? Like that's not a long history of progress.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that we can really do that's easy, that anyone can do, is debunking myths about informed consent care. Because a lot of people, like including folks in the community, including even people that I've met who work in the medical community, really have no idea what informed consent care entails. And with the example, right, of HRT, people will often be like, oh, I don't know, how am I supposed to send somebody in to start hormones without them even knowing what their body is like? They're just going to elect to start these hormones out of nowhere. And there's no understanding that informed consent care still involves medical care. It still involves working with an endocrinologist who looks at your body and looks at your needs, looks at the risks, looks at the benefits, right? The only difference about it is that what's taken out is that gatekeeping component where you have to prove to somebody who's cis, probably almost definitely, that you are trans enough to go talk to that endocrinologist and go pursue that exact same thing that would happen with you under informed consent. So I think that's a very important thing in my experience to really demystify for people, because there's this vague, I think very fictional perspective on informed consent care that's inherently more risky medically for people. Like, how is it more risky for me to start hormones after I talk to some therapist or before? It does not become more or less medically risky for me. But there's this idea, right? Like informed consent care is lower quality care, which again, I don't believe, because a lot of the time, the people that are administering informed consent care are people that are invested in trans people's well-being, especially depending on where you are and what you have access to, right? Like there's much more investment in learning what our specific needs are and explaining that. And for people who don't know, informed consent care, which I think other people can probably explain better, is you are able to access medically necessary gender affirming treatment on the basis of you understanding that you need it, not on the basis of a mental health provider or somebody writing a letter and saying, I think that this person is trans enough to pursue medical transition. I would walk into a clinic like Anchor Health Initiative or somewhere like that. I would say, hi, I'm a trans man. I need to transition. I'd like to start testosterone. They'd take my blood. They would check my levels. They'd recommend a dose for me. And the doctor would monitor me every month and make sure that I'm doing okay. So same medical part minus the gatekeeping part. The last thing I'll say on that topic is there are people that I've talked to who are like, but what if I'm not sure if this is what's best for me? What if I think I would personally benefit from therapy to figure out like how I want to go about this part of my transition, right? And I think it's important to note that for some people that's important, but pursuing therapy as part of coming out as trans doesn't have to be linked with you accessing medical care, right? Those can be two separate things that a person needs for two different reasons. But one doesn't have to be predicated on the other for the entire population. And that's where the danger of gatekeeping comes in. I think it's very important to differentiate there.
And I'm just going to say, like, great points. Like, wow, I was going to say so much of that. And we've just got to stop diagnosing and start treating. It's got to stop. And with therapy, I agree. Like, for instance, this is what I'm doing. This is why I'm getting my master's, because I want to be a therapist for mainly the trans community. But yeah, it doesn't have to be necessary. But I think therapy is also important. Just for anyone, not just, I'm not double standarding this for anyone, but I work now with about I've been working with a bunch of youth doing a lot of therapy, and it's just, it does help them, and is really important. But like you said, when they tie it in all together, I don't believe in that. I'm not going to be, before you do anything, you must talk to me first. I'm just there for them, and they lead the conversation. But I think one of the biggest things is education. These myths. Like, I do a lot of educating, and it's amazing when I talk to doctors and teachers and whoever. They have no idea. They really have they want to learn, but it's not mandatory. These teachings should be mandatory, not volunteer, and especially in the medical and school communities. Oh my God, So that shocks me all the time when I go in there. But the little bit of education they get, they do appreciate, and I'm hoping it at least opens their minds up to this. So to me, the key thing is education, representation. We're getting there, but education is the thing, and we need to learn to tell people, like, yeah, we have to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. But again, reminder, the dysphoria is not with us. The dysphoria is with society. They can't handle us. So there is the dysphoria, and I always say that at every talk of mine. Doesn't lie with us; it lies with them. So.
Absolutely. And speaking of the education piece, it's funny because on Monday I was actually able to speak to a group of Yale med students that are pursuing their degrees in internal medicine. And I was speaking to the people arranging this, and they said, well, today's talk is about 3 hours in total, and that's really what they're going to end up getting when it comes to learning about trans medical care. They're getting about 3 hours in their very lengthy academic career to become our next generation of medical providers. That's not nearly enough.
And I want to say, I'm lucky enough. I'm a standardized patient at Yale, so I get to act. Standardized patient, they give you an illness or whatever, and you have to act it. And a lot of times I sneak, when I start it, I'm like, when the doctor comes in, I'm like, hi, can you tell me your pronouns? And I really think it throws them off. Whoa, I'm sorry, med students, they come in, some say very few say that, hi, I'm so-and-so, she, her pronouns. But a lot of times they're like, Mrs. So-and-so, whatever my surname is. And then I say, hi, I'm Jillian, she, her, what are your pronouns? And they're like, oh, so I'm trying. I mean, I'm subliminally trying to get it in anywhere I can with med students.
That's great.
One thing I want to touch on real quick, and we are getting close to time here. And I definitely do want to touch on just like diagnosis history with insurance, because talking about insurance and diagnosing, that's a separate panel, but we can put the header for that panel in this one. But I do want to touch on really briefly, we talked about informed consent, and that just seems commonsensical in a lot of ways for accessing care, right? It's not like it is dangerous because, like Kirill was talking about, levels are still being measured. You're not just like given a bunch of pills or syringes and like, good luck and have a nice journey. You are fully a patient. But WPATH seems to take that into a much more strict and gatekeeping kind of role for necessarily maybe some good reasons. But I kind of want to pose maybe a little bit of a spicy question. Are WPATH and informed consent inherently at odds? Like, is there a reason to have the WPATH standards of care, say as an educational tool more so, GPs, other medical professionals understand, or is it truly only being utilized as a gatekeeping tool so we don't actually have informed consent, which if you talk, to a couple dozen trans people, most are going to tell you, yes, I know what I need for my body much more than a text that has had to be revised 6-7 times. So I'm not sure how spicy that actually is, but I'm curious what y'all think about that. Before
I don't
maybe
think,
sorry, yeah.
yeah, I don't think they're inherently at odds. I see informed consent as being an evolution of what the WPATH standards are. I mean, we're talking a lot about the negatives of it, but in general, I like the standards of care. It's a huge change from what was being used prior, and I saw that firsthand with my own care. In sort of the fine print, if you look at the standards of care, they do discuss informed consent at a few parts throughout it. And it does say for several instances, the letters from mental health providers are suggestions, they're not requirements. I think, unfortunately, if people were using it as an educational tool, like you said, Elliot, that would be useful, helpful, productive. But instead, we have people using it that are making decisions about insurance coverage. So insurance companies are using the standards of care to decide how they're going to make people prove they need something in order for it to be covered by insurance. And I think that's where the problems come in. As we know, transitioning is not inexpensive.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. I think that it's fully possible to have standards of care, especially if they're centered as an educational tool, that honor and even like mandate informed consent. That's fully possible as an evolution of it. I think my dream for a really equitable situation is what Carly said below, is making free healthcare a human right. Because once we eliminate that power that, for example, an insurance company holds, you have a completely different situation. You have no idea how many providers I've talked to who have been like, I have to give you this diagnosis so that you can access care in the future. I have to give you these, I have to write down this set of codes so that if you land with somebody else, they can't say, oh, your insurance company said that I can't prescribe you this, or I can't refer you for this. You have to have this medical history so that you then don't have to pay insane amounts of money out of pocket to access care that your insurance will then refuse to handle. So I think we would be having a very different conversation if we had basic economic rights around healthcare. And that's where, things like issues of class and issues of accessibility and issues of economic oppression always will intertwine with systemic transphobia. And that's, it's inevitable that this is going to come up. But yeah.
And I know just through my personal experience with insurance companies, I'm very double standard. They'll say, okay, yes, they'll cover, facial feminization surgery, breast augmentation, say for trans women, bottom surgery. Yeah, and then the other section that you're like, does not cover, facial surgery considered cosmetic. So what they do is, and so when I was trying to go for that, they say automatically no matter what you put, it's going to be no. Because they want you to work. They want you to really, really go through the hoops. They'll say no a few times before they finally say yes. So they look like, wow, what a great on paper. Wow, they cover, the trans community. But they, then they have another section they don't. So I've seen a lot of that with insurance companies, and that's got to stop. That has got to stop.
And we see that a lot in Connecticut with Husky. Husky, that's Medicaid D for people in Connecticut who aren't familiar with it. It does cover trans-affirming care, including surgeries, hormones, etc. But they have very strict guidelines that you have to meet in order to do that. And it's pretty much a given. And I would tell my clients, even if you're the most standard patient, it's going to be rejected the first time at least. Usually it would take about 3 appeals. And sometimes we would get back these letters, especially for facial feminization surgery, and it would have these ridiculous questions that the provider would need to answer. Has she tried wearing wigs before? And to no avail. Has she tried wearing makeup? It forces you to have a particular expression of femininity too, in order to even be considered eligible. Because if they don't write back, yes, she tried makeup, she tried contouring herself, like whatever it is that they think makeup will magically do, you have to say that you tried that before they'll even approve you to be considered for surgery, let alone getting it. So on
That's
paper,
so
it's
absurd.
covered. Yeah, it's pretty. It would be funny if it weren't real.
Yeah.
Right, the questions that they ask.
Like, yeah, I'm gonna wear makeup the entirety of my life in every setting.
Yes, go to bed with it,
Yeah.
everything.
Shower with it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's what I do.
Mhm.
Always have to wear the makeup all the time.
And only if your dysphoria persists, then we can consider surgery. And that's not written out anywhere. There's nothing in the Husky guidelines that says, patient must try wearing makeup before we can cover the surgery. You only know when you actually try to get the surgery and you get a letter back, and then you send it again, you have to appeal again. And it becomes this really long process that it's exhausting, it's upsetting. A lot of people don't have understandings of how insurance companies work or how they'll actually be able to get it provided. That's a really stressful occurrence for a lot of people. And unless they have providers that are really willing to go to that for them, they might not be able to move past those hurdles.
Right. Yeah. And I was just going to say that it limits us down. So you get providers who will fight for you, like Anchor Health, I'm sure, that they know what they're doing, they know what to expect. But how many providers in the state of Connecticut really know how to deal? So now my standards of care, I'm only limited maybe 2 or 3 places, if that, who know how to deal with this. So it puts, again, another double standard. We don't have the access, even though we kind of do. We really don't, because we need, providers who know how to handle this.
And it spreads those providers so thin.
Yeah.
Right.
An immense
they
amount
need
of
to
stress.
take the insurance.
Yeah.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then there are very few surgeons that would be covered in the state of Connecticut for these things as well, which that could be a whole conversation in and of itself.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
We won't get into that now.
Yeah.
I'm ready for part 2 and 3. Everybody's info is collected. I think one last thing I am gonna ask before I do my usual outro for closing remarks, but I do kind of want to pose one last thing, and somebody put this in the comments, and I had also heard this as well. There's a new version of Wpath coming out in December, January, around the beginning of the year. We've been having this long conversation. We very much at my prompting, I will say, have been maybe bashing WPATH a little bit more than praising. There are absolutely things to praise, especially compared to the previous system that was in place. But to the point, what revisions are you hoping to see in the new edited version? And what issues are you hoping have been actually addressed? I'm really curious, particularly from this group here, and I will say maybe in a couple short sentences because we are getting close to time. But what are you hoping will change? Post January.
I would like mandated education for medical providers if they're going to be providing care to trans people. I would like to see there to be actually an amount of hours listed that they would say you have to have certain types of training and education. I would like the emphasis to be on informed consent and for the other standards of care to be guidelines or suggestions when appropriate. But really, I think the emphasis should be on informed consent and then making sure that the providers doing the care are educated.
Yeah. And then continuously, just not once, just not like, one for like a yearly, I don't know, or every 2 years, something. It has to, because this is an evolving and changing area. So I love that. I totally agree. I was going to say education too, and informed consent, but in continuous.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think beyond like reclassifying certain other parts as suggestions, framing them very clearly through the same prism of informed consent, where, for example, if a client is unsure, here are avenues that you can explore to help them get sure. Rather than if you're unsure whether this person should transition. Yeah, so like just putting the power back in the trans person's hands. But yeah, no, I agree with all of that, and very much a fan of auditing advising frequently. Because you can say like, oh, let's pull out this like decades old training material that has absolutely no accuracy or relevancy to people, and be like, oh yeah, we train people on trans people, and now they're even more transphobic than they were coming in. So yeah.
Absolutely. All of that, I gotta really say I agree with the training and the education. Doing workshops for schools and other organizations myself through the Pride Center. The need is out there, but so is the appetite. People want these trainings. We are evolving and changing, as Carly writes below, and we are moving forward. But we need to be part of that conversation to actually properly steer. So we're at 12:55, so we have 5 more minutes. We've covered a lot in this conversation, and I know we've noted several times that there's a couple more panels in the topics we have covered. So before I do a little bit of an outro, I'm wondering, thinking back, reflecting on everything that we have talked about, from people not considering trans bodies real, the over medicalization of us, to there being so little education, to the stereotypes and myth that still exist today, even when we're supposed to have had the revised editions getting them out of the standards. Is there, or I should say, which comments would you like to leave the audience with? If you had your last word, what would you want to get across that you think truly was one of the most important moments and points to really take home for anyone watching?
I would say for me, it comes when I do my talks, especially to the smaller communities, like library talks. Yeah, medical and school is really good, but when I do the library talks, so many people say to me, I had no idea I've never met a trans person before. And you're just like everyone else. I mean, I know they mean it. It could be considered a microaggression, but they are really coming from an honest place. And again, it comes back to education. When I hear people like say, "Oh, now I'm going to, my niece is trans. Now I can understand her." So again, it just comes to me when people say, "Wow, like, okay, I get this." That's what it's all about for me. So again, I'm going to say education.
For me, I would say I would like any cisgender people tuned in to be aware that this gatekeeping exists. I would like them to be aware of the standards of care. I would especially like medical providers tuning in to be aware of that. And for trans people, I want them to know that there are other options, that there is something called informed consent, and that there are clinics in the area that do informed consent. Anchor Health does it, Planned Parenthood, I think, on a national level, when legal does informed consent hormone therapy. So there are options to circumvent some of the gatekeeping.
Yeah. I think what I would leave people with is if you're a provider, there's always ways that you can grow. There's always ways that you can learn. Definitely seek out more training for yourself that's led by trans people, because there's always room for that. And I think I think one of the things that is really important for providers to focus on is specifically how are they supporting trans youth, because trans youth have so much less bodily autonomy than trans adults when it comes to determining their own care, and accessing things that are very, very, very necessary. So I think as providers and as community members, we need to get really creative with how we support trans youth in particular and make sure that there's some way for people to access what they need. That's one of the most, difficult things to navigate right now with the current system. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those last remarks. I couldn't agree with all of you more. And I do truly hope that we can organize our controlled chaos to, keep this conversation going. Maybe not necessarily around WPATH specifically, but around the medicalization of trans people and also the options that people might not understand are out there for them within the trans community. So on that note, I want to thank you all so much for this incredible conversation. Truly, I have been wanting to do it for so long, and I'm so happy. I'm going to be sending emails and please say yes for the next one. When we are talking about how we move through the world as trans people, right, our lived reality, is too often left out of the conversation when certain standards are being decided for us legally, medically, and inherently socially because of those things. And conversations like this around marginalized communities, nothing about us without us really has to be the motto. Otherwise, you're leaving out the only voice that can speak the whole truth collectively. So with my own last comment, a big thank you to all of our panelists today. I hope you join me again for another conversation. As we've looked at the progress we've made as a community in destigmatizing gender affirming care, there's still so much to be done. I'm especially excited for providers who have heard these perspectives and can now think more critically about how to trust their trans clients, which was something we definitely talked on a little bit. I feel incredibly lucky to be part of the New Haven Pride Center and participate in important conversations like this. The center is here for you year-round with dynamic programming. We have online and virtual panels like this happening all year. We also have case management services. We have performances. We have art exhibits. We have a gender-affirming closet that has binders and wigs and eyelashes, and also just, you know, a t-shirt that fits, shoes, winter clothing, since the cold snap is coming, and just so much more. If you want to find out more about our upcoming programming, you can go to our website. It's newhavenpridecenter.org, especially since we are in Trans Week of Awareness. We have a lot of panels coming up. So if you go to our site, on the homepage on the left-hand side, there's a calendar with everything coming up. If you are feeling a little bit more social media minded, we are on Facebook very actively, and you can find us there too. You can also find us on Instagram at New Haven Pride Center, and you can also find us on Twitter, which is just at New Haven Pride. Something to keep in mind for those of you watching: a lot of people don't know that we have an entire archive of all of our panels, presentations, conversations that we have held on YouTube. So if you've missed a panel, if you maybe caught the only last little bit of this conversation and you're like, oh, I wish I could have seen it all, if you go to youtube.com/C/New Haven Pride Center, it is all there. It's truly a great way to kind of dig into what topics we've covered and maybe find some topics that you'd like to recommend to us to pick back up again. On that vein, if you have any concerns, comments, questions, whether it's about trans, non-binary, and intersex programming, you know, my wheelhouse, or if you're just looking for resources, you know, you're a parent looking for some direction, or you want to talk about possible trainings or workshops, you can contact me at trans@newhavenpridecenter.org, and more generally, you can contact the center itself at info@newhavenpridecenter.org. I know a lot of emails. Lastly, as a pro tip, if you enjoyed today's program, please consider joining as a member. It's completely free. You can do that at newhavenpridecenter.org/join now. Last but not least, we are a community organization built by and for the community. We are a nonprofit, and we rely on donations, grants to keep providing the services, panels, educational programs, support spaces that we do. So you have some extra change in your pocket, or if you don't know what to do with that birthday check that grandma gave you, go to newhavenpridecenter.org/donate. You are helping provide panels like this. You are helping put on socials for youth groups. You are helping us provide materials for events like TDOR, Trans Day of Remembrance. It really goes so far for us, and we can't thank you enough. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you again to our amazing panelists. Y'all are awesome, and I look forward to the next conversation. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day.